Welcome to Inside ArtScroll, where the books that we read and the people that write them come to life. It's a distinct pleasure to welcome, for the very first time, to ArtScroll Studios, Gedalia Guttentag. Shalom Aleichem.
Aleichem Shalom.
It's wonderful having you here, and Mazel Tov and congratulations on your very first book with ArtScroll.
Or at all.
At all, that's true as well. The book Rav Simcha Kook, a magnificent book, really a masterpiece, super inspiring, very informative, required reading. And how does it feel to put out your very first book?
I'm a writer, but this is a different level to have, to have got to this stage, Baruch Hashem.
Should we tell the people that watch this our relationship? What do you think?
I mean, yeah, it's maybe
So Gedalia Guttentag and I are first cousins.
In-law.
In-law. That means he's married to my first cousin. To me, that's like a first cousin, and it's super exciting to have a first cousin in ArtScroll Studios. But I don't know if you know this, you are not my first cousin who has sat in ArtScroll Studios. As a matter of fact, I've interviewed somebody else who is also my first cousin through marriage. And if you're able to tell us who my first cousin is, you could win a brand new copy of Rav Simcha Kook. We'll have a little raffle. Whoever enters and gets the right answer could win this really beautiful masterpiece of a book. All you got to do is email Inside ArtScroll at artscroll.com. That's Inside ArtScroll at artscroll.com. At some point, we will tally up all the raffles. We'll draw one person out. And if you know who my first cousin is that I interviewed, you could win a brand new book. Okay, that was a pause for station identification.
That was the golden ticket.
That's the golden ticket. Okay, Gedalia, I want to ask you a question. So, first of all, how do you come to writing? What's your background? You have a great British accent. You live in Israel. When did you start writing? And share with us a little bit more about your writing career.
So, my writing career was relatively late in life. I say that with all the gravitas of someone approaching middle age. 8 or 9 years at Mishpacha magazine, where I'm one of the editors, and a certain stage, the writing bug, which exists in kind of op-ed form and feature form. What we do in magazines is the maximum I've ever written in one goes. For features is 10,000 words. But I always knew that somehow there's a lot of books inside. The big struggle is, for a writer, I don't know how it is with other writers, for myself, for a writer, the hardest thing to do is actually to write. Writers can do anything. They'll go and interview, they'll go and talk about it, they'll talk around it, but to sit down and write is not going to happen. So the books only work with, for myself, or projects of this length, with a deadline and a cause and a very tight timetable, and this is where this particular book came. Yep.
What was the first piece of writing that you wrote that got published? Do you remember?
Look, my career begins not with writing. It begins with My Dog Spot. Okay, My Dog Spot is a poem. I wouldn't know where to find it. But I won, when I was about 7 years old, the poetry competition in my elementary school, my primary school. So that is my... Now, to be fair, I've never got... There's probably a reason I've not got into poetry, and that's because My Dog Spot is as far as it went. But communication, words, I suppose it's no surprise that the first thing that I published, hard to remember, lost in the mist of time. But there was many years when I didn't write at all.
Learned.
I learned. I was in Gateshead and Mir, and I was in Kira for many years in Tel Aviv. And it was actually there that I got back into writing, because I was working for Rav Yaakov Hillel. He's got a big Kira organization. People don't know, but along with his huge, his Kabbalah yeshiva and his huge yeshivas kolelim, he's got a Kira organization, and I did some writing for them, and that was when the bug started to, that dormant feeling, of restlessness that a writer has because those words are welling up inside and you can't get them out on paper. It started to come back, and it was interesting. At some stage, Mishpacha magazine, which is actually the source for why this book exists. I didn't quite know the story myself, but when Rav Simcha Kook, who I'm sure we're going to get into,
of course,
when he was Nifta, somebody contacted Mishpacha and said, for a shloshim, do someone write about this? And it's one of these things that bounced around, like, who knew? Rav Simcha Kook, the chief rabbi of Rechovot. And it meant something to me. And I said, I'll take that. And look, these things are min hashamayim, and I knew of him. And I wrote for a shloshim a piece which people enjoyed, and that eventually led a few years later to this book. So there's and it was only at the end of the book that I writing the book that I realized who'd forwarded it to ArtScroll, or why it had got to ArtScroll. Forwarded it to Mishpacha, and why it got to Mishpacha. That was because the publisher of Mishpacha was in his Rav Simcha Kook's yeshiva, and I didn't know that when I was writing the book. I found that out right at the end.
Hashem runs the world.
Hashem runs the world. This book was meant to be written. Here we are.
So let's dive right in. Take us into this book. There's so many Gedalim. There's so many people to write biographies. Who approached you? Like, did you all of a sudden decide, this is a wonderful person, I want to know more? Did someone ask you to write a book? And then when they did, I know that you've been offered more than one time to write a biography. What spoke to you so deeply that you invested the last year and a half into Rav Simcha Kook's life?
So the mechanics of this was I was approached by Rav Simcha Kook's family, and they wanted to preserve his memory. And to tell his story really. And the story spoke to me because he was, the title over here is A Beacon of Unity. He was an absolutely unique individual in his ability to unite, to talk to all of Klal Yisrael. I'll just give you one in my mind that goes with one sentence that someone said to me. This is a man who was as a boy who drove Rav Simcha around, and he was an iconic figure across Israel. He was Rav Kook. Now you have to understand, in Israel, the resonance of the name Cook, if whatever you're feeling here in America, this is royalty. And he was Rav Kook. He was a great nephew of the famed Rav Kook, and his father, Rav of Kook, was the closest Talmud to his uncle, right? To Rav Kook. Spent 10 years. His last 10 years, he was produces Sfarim, a legendary, an unbelievable figure in his own right, Rav of Kook. And Rav Simcha Kook was this unifying figure. He was the only person who could bring around the table everyone in Israel, a total consensus figure. This person who drove him around as a teenager, then eventually became a local politician in Rechovot, where Rav Kook was chief rabbi. And he said to me once, I took him around one Elul day. Listen to this, a schedule. I drove him around. In the morning, we drove to some secular place. I remember the Weizmann Institute, he spoke, it's a big, whatever it was, some secular. In the afternoon, a dati, like a Bnei Akiva school, okay? And in the evening, I drove him to give a shir in Panovich. Now, that encapsulates the story, because this was one person who was royalty everywhere he went. Groups that wouldn't talk to each other, who never crossed paths, he was able to talk to them and do so in a way without compromising. People understood Rav Kook was a big person, a big Torah figure. He didn't change at all wherever he went, but he was a consensus figure. And I often think about it, it was like this, Chazal say about Esther Amalka. Every country, all the Armenians said she's ours, and the Babylonians said she's ours, and everyone claimed Rav Simcha Kook as theirs. The Litvaks, well, of course he's a Litvak, right? And the Datil, the Datil Umi or the Bnei Akiva, of course he's ours.
Rav Kook.
He was Rav Kook, but it wasn't. But you have to know, it wasn't just the name, because and this is the other thing why he was an iconic figure and such a unique figure, because he wasn't just trading on his name, right? He was a person whose activity was unrivaled. And I'll give you an example. He founded and built a very big classical yeshiva in Rechovot. It was a city with a yeshiva history, right, that goes back to, that went back a while, but it had no yeshiva then. And he built today that yeshiva is 600-700 big institution.
One of big yeshivas.
Yeah. And at the same time, he was the same person who was responsible for the existence and funding of an organization called Ateret Kohanim, which buys up places, Jews in the Muslim quarter of the old city. And at the same, he was the same person, okay, who was considered one of the spiritual leaders of Gush Katif pre-evacuation. He had Talmudei Torah there that were his, right? So he was the one person. Where do you ever find? Where have we found anyone for decades? In fact, it's really that person lived 3.5 years ago. You know, he was there, a consensus figure, and as you say, it was the Avos Yisrael. He genuinely loved each Jew, and that was so genuine, so powerful that he was accepted everywhere, and his leadership was unquestionably accepted from, you know, prime minister level down to the guy on the street corner who I met, you know, not the prime minister, but the guy on the street corner. It really was, as I said, and this is what clicked. I said, we have to preserve this story because this man is not some figure, mythical figure of a distant past who managed in some prehistoric era to unite all the different kippot and those, you know, all the different head coverings. No. This guy was here. I never met him. He spent a lot of time in Staten Island and in, you know, down in Baltimore and coming, and he spoke when he came here to America. I mean, there in the book you see on the same trip, he spoke at APAC, he spoke at OU, and he spoke in the Aguda. Now, who does that? That was Rav Kook. That was Rav Simcha Kook. He was an Adam Gadol Ad Ma'od, an iconic figure who I think that story needs to be told. It's possible. He did it.
So take us back to like his humble beginnings. I know it's fascinating to learn about, you know, the old Yerushalayim in 1948, but like, what takes a fellow like this who grew up in the mainstream yeshiva world, went to mainstream yeshivas, was close to the Gedalim of that time, and then he picks himself up and he ends up in Rechovot, which was not at that time at all a Haredi town. How did he get there? What pushed him there?
So, what pushed him there was a tragedy. His older brother, who was a genius, who was a tremendous Talmud Chacham, was Rav Shlomo Kook, died in a tragedy. Those who remember back in 1971 it was, he and his wife and I think 3 children were in the car. The family was, you know, they were killed in a on Hanukkah, crossing, they got stuck on a train hit them. And the older brother was at age 36, 37 or something like that, a young chief rabbi, up and coming. Rav Simcha himself said, no question, he would have been the chief rabbi, and a brilliant figure, brilliant in the authentic, old-fashioned sense of what he was. And Rav Simcha, and in that same year, Rav Simcha's father was niftar. Rav Simcha's father was a very special person. I think we mentioned Rabbi Kook, who was a Talmud at the same time of 2 iconic, legendary figures at the same time, the Briskerov and the Rav Simcha Kook, same time. And he was the chief rabbi of Tveria for the last 25 years. Rabbi Shlomo was chief rabbi of Tveria. So within a few months, they were niftar of each other. They were niftar, and 2 family positions, as it were, came open. Now, Rav Simcha Kook was not at that point a rav. He was a mechanech, and a very gifted one at that. And this explains a lot about who he was and what he did. He founded a yeshiva in Bnei Akiva yeshiva in Netanya. And for 10 years he led this, and in the course of that he became very close to the Tzanz Rebbe, the Tzanz Klozen Rebbe, who noticed the same thing. He was very young. He said, this man is able to unify absolutely everyone. So he in Netanya, which was a very secular city then, he ran the Tzanz Rebbe said, or the Klozenberg Rebbe as they called him, can you run for the city council and get everyone Orthodox underneath you, the Hasidim, the non-Orthodox, everyone traditional, and he did. He ran a city hall, and I spoke to people there who were with him, and he said what a Kiddush Hashem he made. Because Rav Simcha Kook, and this is one of the things that I learned, you go into a book, you know, you're a kind of I didn't know him, right? Although others I know did. And you go in, you kind of a blank slate, which is an advantage if you're going to biography. You can
There's
go
no bias,
no bias, just tell me the story, and you start noticing things. And I went in and I would think, well, he's kind of one of these rabbinic political figures, right? Very famous, and a tremendous charisma, tremendous orator. And I thought, here's the person, and he's a strong political person. And I discovered that's not the story of Simcha Kook. And this is what, again, was so special. He was a tzaddik of an extraordinary kind. We have a, just parentheses, sorry to go off on this, a chapter in there called Letters to Hashem. And this is hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of kvitlach that he wrote to Hashem. He had a little Orna Kodesh in his study. The little Orna Kodesh inside was Sefer Torah, and when he had a problem, and this was multiple times a day, he would write a note to Hashem, stick it inside, and daven, 10 minutes. And I sat there and genuinely moved to tears. Sat there, his son had like a whole collection of them. Like I flicking through his things. What are these? And I've got pictures of some of them there. He was just a tzaddik. He says, Hashem, please help me build a yeshiva. And you can see it's 30 years old, whatever. Please help me with this problem, the kashrus in the city. Please help there should be no machlokas in the city. Please help that the 2 chayalim who've been kidnapped, right, we don't know what they is, but I suppose in the 90s, by the age of the notes or something, should be okay. Please help that those who want to take away the unity of Yerushalayim, to talk about the Oslo process, should fail. And then he has a note about Hebron, and he was a tzaddik. He had this tremendous relationship with Hashem that people didn't know about. That means everyone could see he was a holy person, and I think that something communicates itself. That picture that had responding there,
beautiful picture.
Yeah. But I, as a biographer, you can't hide. You can hide a lot of things from a lot of people, and you can fake a lot of things. What you can't fake is that those findings. And there were dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens, and this was a normal thing. And he would bring people actually to this. There's a little Orna Kodesh in his room, because he had a lot of secular people who came to him for advice or whatever, or couples before they got married, and he would bring them to them, and he'd say, and his room is Sfarim. He had hundreds of Sfarim. They're all arranged in a very unusual way. They weren't arranged by topic, they're arranged by era. So it started that his library contained the little Sefer Torah. Then afterwards had Nevi'im, and then afterwards everything. And he went through. Everything was arranged by era. Can you imagine? Have you ever seen a study like this? Brilliant. And then he would invite people in and he would say, look, you know what? Imagine teaching a chassan class like this. He would say, let's not talk about this. Let's talk about what the background to this. Do you know what this is? And he went through Moshe Kibbel Torah Messina. This is this, and this is this, and this is when they started talking about the problems of and he'd go through the tshuvas, and he'd go through 100 till the day. He said, okay, now we can talk about the Torah's attitude to marriage. You understand what we're talking about? He would then leave the couple at the end. He would say, okay, now you've heard and I've learned something. Open the Orna Kodesh. I want you to daven, and he'd go out and leave them there.
So inspiring.
The man was a powerhouse. He personally was responsible for, dozens and dozens and dozens of people absolutely directly became Baalei Teshuva through him. Neighbors, if you moved in the area, you were finished, basically. In fact, I spoke to one of the persons who says his neighbor, one of the people who became Baalei Teshuva, who through him in his later years, the guy was about 28, 29 years, and he was a young teen when he moved in, and he said, I knew I'm going to get caught by the Rav. So he said, for months I refused to look at him. I met him in the corridor, I put my head down and ran past him. Eventually he got me. He said, we had another neighbor who didn't want to be caught, he moved away.
Unbelievable.
Yeah.
And it came probably from his Avos Yisrael, just was exuding. You see such a person, what are you supposed to do?
Yeah. He was. That's what it was. There was nothing judgmental, nothing. He loved Jews with an ava which is unbelievable. Yeah.
Can you talk just for a minute about what he did in his town? Because that's fascinating, how he transformed the town of Rechovot.
So that is the story here, because in essence, I mean, you got to ask yourself. So it's a chief rabbi sounds grandiose, but it's an Israeli city with important university. But he was much more, and what he did in Rechovot showed what can be done, what he was able to do elsewhere. He took a city that was it's a university town. It's got traditional parts to it, but it's a city of it's called Rechovot Ir HaMadar, the city of science, and they pride themselves in this. It's not just it's a lot of it's not just a university. There's other research institutes, so it's that type of liberal place you'd expect. He took a city that was already open for traffic on Shabbos, etc. The status quo, which is the well-known Israeli thing saying, whatever existed pre-state, we're going to continue. The status quo was secular, open on Shabbos. And whilst the whole country was getting more secular, meaning everything opening up more and more on Shabbos, as we see this, the trend, it's a big battle for Shabbos, he convinced the secular heads of the city fathers, right, literally, to close his city on Shabbos. That's what he was able to do. I'll tell you something. I asked the mayor who was responsible for it, meaning it was a long 20, 30-year thing, 30-year campaign. How did he do that? He was a secular guy. This mayor's son is a member of one of Israel's most secular parties, Israel Beitenu. This guy I talked to is not a religious guy remotely. It's not like, wow, he's caught up. No. I said to him, what did Rav Kook say to you to persuade you to vote to close the city down on Shabbos? And he said something. I thought I was just amazed. He said, we're all Volozhiners. We're all from Volozhin. That's what the Rav said. So I said, what? We're all from Volozhin. Like, asked him to repeat. Did I hear that correctly? He said, yeah. This man, his name's Shuki Fora. His great-grandfather was Yoshua Fora, who in 1890 bought the land, was a Volozhiner. Rechovot was indeed founded by Volozhiners. Now, I didn't realize, I thought Rav Simcha Kook was just playing up the Rav Kook connection. Rav Kook, Rav Yitzchak Kook, learnt in Rechovot, in Volozhin. But what I discovered was that, no, the Cooks, when all the way back, they were a Cook, a Nochem Cook. The names kept reappearing, right, throughout history. The same names were used 200 years ago, was a founding student of Rav Chaim Volozhin, in Yeshuvas Volozhin. So when Rav Simcha Kook said, I'm a Volozhiner, he meant it, right? But I couldn't believe it. This guy says we closed it down because he's a Volozhiner. So I said, that's when I realized we were dealing with someone. It wasn't just a way of saying something. If you and I would get up and say, well, I think we should close down Tel Aviv because we all come from Mir, I don't think it worked with anyone else. Rav Simcha Kook had a koach hadibur and a question, an ability to speak, but it was him. He had that Avas Yisrael, that Avas Hashem. It just communicated itself. He was an incredible force in that. And this mayor told me another thing. It's just one of these things. I don't think it made it into the book, but it just sticks in my mind as one of these great moments which you realize you're dealing with someone exceptional. Because I said to the beginning of the conversation to this mayor, I said to him, tell me about Rav Kook. So he was very suspicious. So, what does the guy want? So what do you want me to say? I say exactly, just tell me the truth. I said, what was your relationship? He said, well, it was very correct. I was the mayor, he was the chief rabbi, we had a working relationship. But he kept thinking about it, because he kept talking. And a minute later, he pops up and he says, no, actually, I was very friendly with the Rav. But he wasn't yet done. He kept thinking about it because he was continuing with the conversation and he suddenly burst out. He said, no, actually, I want to say that I loved the Rav. Oh. That was Rav Simcha Kook. He had that, it was the Avas Hashem, it was Kamayim Haponim Haponim, the Avas Yisrael, people felt it. That was the secret.
And I'm assuming that's the message that you pulled out of this book, that if you have the right Avas Yisrael, you could get through to anyone.
Yeah, it's the message that's subliminal. It's not, I didn't know, I think it's just such an obvious thing. Again, in the subtitle, Beacon of Unity, the unity came from that because he wasn't like, well, kumbaya, let's all be friends together. He was, in a sense, one of the greatest kanoim that you can imagine, because there is no cause that he didn't fight when it came to holy, what he considered holy, Shabbos. How did he shut down the city on Shabbos? He had protests, but not far from violent protests. He was protests at which there was no other protest in the country before or since, which succeeded in getting traditional people out there, right? This was not religious. He had Kabbalah Shabbos protests, and there was no protest. It was a tefillah rally in the purest, most joyous sense. And there was, at some stage, there was his opponents. He had opponents. Remember, this is a secular city. Meretz is Israel's far-left political party. They had the youth of Meretz, and they campaigned, and they one event they said, we're going to protest against him. And so the police came, etc. This is Kabbalah Shabbos, and there was nothing except Kabbalah Shabbos in the street. That's all it was. And Rav Simcha used to say a very important thing. We're not protesting against something or someone. We're protesting for. That's what he was for. He was for. And people remember that from that. Anyway, so at this event, you had this counter-protest. who turned up 10 teenagers. Where did Rav Simcha Kook go? And this is absolutely genuine. He went over to them and he said, can I make Kiddush for you? You know, have you heard Kiddush? Well, they hadn't heard Kiddush and they probably wouldn't have heard Kiddush. And they were thrown like, what is his agenda? He says, no, I want to make Kiddush. He went out to his house and he came down and he came to make Kiddush for them. And then he said, are you going to eat, can I invite you for a meal? And there was suspicion. They came up for a meal. And some of these kids, one or two of them became religious afterwards because they just were caught, were this great light, drawn to this, the great light. You see, he showed, and this is an important thing again, he showed that there's a possibility to unify people, and that Israel is a tremendously riven place. He showed it doesn't have to be that way. They can be unified around Jewish tradition, right? But it's got to be done with it's got to be genuine. And I quote in there something so powerful that Rav Shach said about him, or to him, or I think he said about him. Rav Shach believed in him, and he sent him to the Knesset to, on behalf of many of the religious kind of, the issues of Israel's religious character. And Rav Shach said about him, he says, when other people, religious people, talk about Shabbos, everyone understands they're really talking about money, right? They just want more money. So we'll talk about Shabbos, but it's a way of getting a bigger budget. He says, when Rav Simcha Kook talks about Shabbos, he means Shabbos.
That's amazing. It's a beautiful line. Gedalia, I feel like we're just literally touching the tip of the iceberg.
We literally are.
Yes. I highly encourage you to go out and buy this book and carve out some time to understand what genuine Avos Yisrael is about, to understand the history of the state of Israel, the country, the people, and most importantly, to understand where a person can get to when they have the most genuine and open, giving personality possible. That's a gadol. That's a gadol.
Definitely.
Chef, continued hatzlacha, and I can't wait to see, by the way, who the next biography is going to be of. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you very much.
My pleasure.